You've probably seen the headlines. An accusation comes out against a big name celebrity, a wave of posts hit social media, and then suddenly lawyers are involved. Australia's defamation laws are some of the toughest in the world, so much so that they can protect abusers and even silence survivors overnight. I'm Poppy Reed, and I break down stories from music, film, and culture, and I spoke to Michael Bradley, who is the managing partner at Mark Lawyers. So he has this really strong human rights interest, and he actually advocates for sexual violence survivors. He's also the chair of the Rape and Sexual Assault Advocacy Initiative, which leads policy reform in that area. And he wrote the book System Failure: The Silencing of Rape Survivors, because he wanted to explore the legal system's responses and why they are designed without the survivor in mind. I asked him to break down how a defamation war actually unfolds and what creators, journalists, and anyone posting online should know. This is a bit of a longer video than you've seen me posting lately, but it was definitely a conversation worth having.
Say someone famous gets accused of something online. What is happening behind the scenes in your experience in those first 48 hours?
So very much depends on the facts, because there's only one person who knows the whole story, and that is the person who's been accused. And one thing we know for sure is that most perpetrators of sexual violence are serial perpetrators, in fact, pretty much all of them. So if there is any truth to the allegation that's broken, the perpetrator, if it's true, will know that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? And so on that side of the equation, if he's being honest with himself and his advisors, the calculation that's going on is going to be heavily driven by risk assessment of what else is out there. And is it going to come out, and can we prevent it, and what can we do about it? So there's an absolute information imbalance, because both the complainant, the person who's come out and made the allegation, and the media reporting it only know a small fraction of the whole story, whereas the guy on the other side, he knows the whole story. And so he has a sort of tactical benefit of that, but he also has a problem because he knows, so you think about Harvey Weinstein, when the stories first started emerging, they had it. I mean, obviously there was a very long lead up, because over many years they'd been paying survivors off for silence, and they'd been engaging in all sorts of legal and illegal acts to try to keep a lid on this volcano. When the Me Too movement broke and women started coming forward, and initially it was just, a couple, and then it became a few. The response from the Weinstein camp was basically to try to continue the same playbook, but that no longer worked. And they rapidly became overwhelmed as the numbers grew. Now that is just a critical mass question. That is just basic dynamics, physics, if you like. And so that is one thing that anyone advising, whether lawyers or PR people or whatever, advising someone who's in that position of having, that first accusation having been broken, they need to know what else is out there, what else could come. They'll be configuring their response around that. So an example, when the allegations started coming out about Alan Jones a couple of years back, I'm not going to talk about the case against him. I'm certainly not suggesting anything in relation to his guilt or innocence, because his criminal case is in front of the courts. But one of his initial reactions was to threaten to sue everyone for defamation. And his lawyers said, "Stop publishing, we're coming after you." They never have. And that is simply because of the volume. Right? That just became a losing game, regardless of, the truth or falsehood of the allegations against him. Once he was facing so many complainants, defamation was no longer a viable mechanism for restoring, saving his reputation.
So would you say then that social media has become a way for multiple survivors to essentially band together and fight, I guess, the defamation laws that are quite restrictive in this country?
Yeah, social media has had enormous impact, partly through misunderstanding, because for a long time, most people sort of developed this belief that everything that happens on social media is in some sort of alternative universe where laws don't apply. So a lot of people came out, and it still happens a lot. People say all sorts of wild things on social media that they would never say in real life, because they feel they have this sort of, protection of the blanket of the internet, and there's some sort of immunity that applies online, which is completely untrue. And, a lot of people have come a cropper as a result and been sued, for things they've said on social media. But what it does is is it provides a direct path for people who have something to disclose to do that, not mediated through the mediator, but direct. And obviously the viral impact and potential of social media far outstrips the capacity of the traditional media to disseminate and spread a story and in a way that it can never be brought back again. So once it's out there forever. And so at a practical level, that capacity for social media to overwhelm the defences of someone who's trying to shut a story down just has completely changed the game.
And then that also makes social media one of the most dangerous places for defamation to happen.
Totally. And yeah, I mean, the law applies the same way. So there is no immunity for just because you're on social media, and there are as many defamation cases these days that are purely about social media publications as there are about traditional media publications. So yes, it is a dangerous place.
On that, I have a question around defamation and social media. So say if someone reposts or likes or comments on a defamatory post, could they possibly be sued for defamation also?
Yeah, so yes, here's the short answer. So defamation, so a person can be sued for defamation if they are a publisher of a defamatory piece of defamatory material. So in the online context, the person who originally posts something defamatory, they are a publisher of that. A person who reposts it is also a publisher of it. There is no case law about likes, and that is an open question. Depending on the view the courts would take of that, I would think probably a like it would not be treated as a republication, but it might, because obviously it does amplify and it puts that publication into other forums, other people's accounts and so forth. So yes, there's risk there. It is also the case that a person who is hosting an account online and is hosting comments posted by other people that are defamatory is potentially liable for those posts. Now, it's a complex question. There's been a lot of case law about it. Media companies are more at risk of that sort of third-party liability for hosting, not moderating the comments that are posted on their pages. But it's certainly true if, for example, if someone posts a comment on your Facebook account that is defamatory and you are put on notice of that by the person who's been defamed and you don't do anything about it, you don't take it down, you're going to be liable for keeping it up there.
Mm-hmm. And then speaking of, notices and that kind of strategy of someone who's been accused sending cease and desist, we've seen a lot of that within the arts industry, especially in Australia. I wonder, how should, say, the publisher of a piece of content, or a post, or who's created a post and have then been sent a cease and desist, how should journalists and creators handle those that are coming forward in the arts industry right now?
I mean, first, you should always take it seriously. In defamation, the notice you get is called a concerns notice under the Defamation Act. It's a prerequisite for defamation proceedings. You have to issue a concerns notice first. So it's a serious threat. They are spread across the landscape like confetti. So 99% of them don't lead anywhere. But yes, serious publishers should take them seriously. What you do about it is, there are a few different tactical approaches. Obviously, if they've got you, then you need to do something constructive to undo the harm or minimise the harm. If you have actually published something that's indefensibly defamatory. If it's an empty threat, then some media, certainly some independent media, have a practice of publishing all legal threats they receive, and there's nothing stopping you doing that, regardless of whether the person sending it has tried to claim that it's confidential. It's not. So transparency is quite a good principle to apply.
Why do they have that strategy of publishing their cease and desist? How would that benefit the publisher or the creator from putting that out in the world?
Because A, it exposes the threat, and B, it sends a message to everyone that publisher is not scared and will not get into silence by legal threats. So it'll make anyone think twice, partly because of the Streisand effect, that, if sending wild legal threats around the countryside about something that's been published about you that you just don't like, you're putting yourself at risk of actually amplifying the thing you don't like, which may not be defamatory at all, which it certainly wasn't in the case of Barbara Streisand.
Yeah. And okay, from your experience then, how much of defamation cases are really about either revenge against someone who they feel has wronged them, or is about control, like control of the narrative?
Very, very often about control. Yes, everyone has a right to a good reputation, and if someone publishes something about you that is, scandalous and false, then yeah, the law is there to vindicate that reputation. But most of the time, that's not what we're talking about. Most of the time, it's people with power or privilege or money who are unhappy that something about them they would rather not be exposed is being exposed, or opinions about them that they would prefer not be expressed are being expressed. And they want to use their power to shut that down, to control the narrative. It is often wielded as a silencing weapon. There have been many cases, or quite a number of cases now, where men accused of being sexual predators have sued not just media, but their accusers personally. And that is a deliberate tactic to send a message to all their other victims, shut up, or I'm going to sue you.
And you said earlier that with a lot of cases that you've experienced where there is a sexual predator involved, it's never usually just the one instance when someone speaks out. So do you have any advice for survivors of sexual harassment, sexual assault, where the predator is quite litigious?
Yeah, look, it's, the position of a sexual assault or harassment survivor is always invidious. The one thing they should have is that it never happened in the first place, and that can't be delivered. The choices available to them are all crap. Be silent, speak up, go to the police, sue them, whatever. Like none of these are good options. They're all risky. They will all involve re-traumatization, and none of them are going to be fun. So it's really important that a survivor contemplating doing something like going public really fully understands the potential consequences of that, what the risks are, and is really conscious about how they can protect themselves. And there are a couple of practical steps they can take. One is to get advice so that they understand, any legal risk they're taking on. It is beneficial generally to work with reputable media rather than go out on your own, because media will be very mindful of the legal risk and will be managing that legal risk in a way that will also protect the survivor. And a big part of that is working out how to get the story out in a legally safe and defensible way. But the most important thing, honestly, is that there is strength in numbers. Because it is the numbers that overwhelm the perpetrator and change the game, as we were just, discussing at the outset. If you go one out, he's going to come after you and he's going to try to shut you down. If there are two of you, your strength is massively multiplied. If there are four of you, it's exponentially multiplied. And of course, the courage of each survivor's action encourages others. None of them should be in that position. None of them should have to be making these choices, but they can derive enormous strength from each other and withstand the pressure and the assault, the strategic assault that they will face, and all the silencing tactics together much more effectively and powerfully than on their own. And we've seen this play out in multiple cases during the Me Too era and continuing. And you can often see this play out in real time, where it sort of starts with one, there's a story, other women come forward, and you can pretty much predict where it goes from there, how it plays out. And some good worked example of how this played out was the Craig McLaughlin case, where he was accused of pretty gross sexual harassment and indecent assaults of fellow cast members, during stage productions. And when the story sort of first broke, he launched defamation proceedings against the media company that had published the story and one or more of his accusers. He sued them personally. And when that got to court, midway through the trial, the defence gave notice that they were bringing forward 13 other alleged victims who were going to testify about what McLaughlin had done to them, and he dropped the case cold because he wasn't going to win against that. Now, people can form their own opinions about the truth or falsehood of that. I have pretty strong opinions about whether 13 or 14 different women are all going to make up completely false accusations against a powerful man just because, for fun. But, mechanically and strategically, that was a pretty clear-cut case of, how these things can play out.
I think that is one of the myths that I would love to help debunk around women who do come forward. I think that there was a lot of dialogue around the Me Too movement of women being accused of wanting 15 minutes of fame, of wanting revenge, of having, a really disgusting term that I've seen in social media posts is buyer's remorse, where it was consensual and then until they felt that it wasn't later.
Yep.
And I think that, and you would know so much through your incredible work that you've done and the small amount of work that I've done with some survivors in the arts industry, that there is no selfish reason to come forward. In fact, it is entirely selfless, isn't it?
Yeah, look, every survivor who comes forward is accused of those things. Like that's routine. That victim blaming begins immediately and it accelerates as the thing progresses. They're always accused of all of the things you've said. And yeah, I've worked with hundreds of survivors. I have not met one who wanted fame or who wanted money. In fact, I haven't even met one who wanted revenge. So, I understand the impulse that drives this victim blaming. Ultimately, it comes from a social or a societal desire to believe that we are not surrounded by rapists. But in fact, we are. Statistically, that is a fact. We are surrounded by rapists. And yet the statistical probability that a man who commits a rape will be convicted of that crime is less than 0.5%. So
less than 0.5%.
Less than 1/2 or 1%, yes.
Oh my gosh.
That is the statistical reality. That is equivalent to the decriminalisation of rape. And so those are the facts. And they just reflect that as a society, we have not come to terms with the fact that we are living in a swamp of sexual violence and we are tolerating it. And so naturally, every time a woman puts her hand up and says, that happened to me, society circles its wagons around the man who's been accused and comes up with every reason imaginable that cannot be true. And if that means burning her at the stake, so be it.
I do find it so interesting that, we have been talking about a sexual predator. We've been talking about instances of harassment and assault, and we have both used the term he and him when we talk about sexual predators.
Yeah, and that's just a fact. I guess, of course, there is a lot of male-on-male sexual violence. There is female-on-female sexual violence. There's even some female-on-male sexual violence. They're all statistically, very small pieces of the puzzle. The vast majority of perpetration of adult victims is by men on women. In terms of child victims, child sexual abuse, it's much more balanced. Still majority female, but a much higher proportion of boys are predated upon by men than adult victims, and there are physical reasons for that. But in both cases, the vast majority of perpetrators are men, and it's not political correctness gone wrong to just acknowledge that fact.
Thank you so much. I think it's been made quite clear to me that the defamation laws in this country, at least, protect abusers. Is there an update coming? Is there legislation being changed in order to protect our survivors a little bit more?
I mean, look, some of the one of the changes to the defamation law in the last 5 years has had and will have significant beneficial impact in this field. So this was the introduction of a new defence called the public interest defence, which makes it much easier for media to publish stories in the public interest without having to prove their truth. So previously, what was really hamstringing media in terms of telling stories of sexual violence allegations was that their only viable defence was truth. And that's a very high bar when you're talking about rape. Public interest defence works without having to prove truth. And so as long as media who want to report these stories are doing it in a responsible and ethical way and ticking all the boxes and doing all the right things in terms of good investigative that the allegations are true, and that's incredibly powerful. So that has made a big difference and will continue to. Another change that is coming is that people who report rape allegations to the police will be given statutory immunity from being sued in relation to the report, because it's a bit of a hole still in the law. It'll make a minor difference, but it's still women who choose to sort of go their own direction, like publicly disclose their allegations through social media directly, are still pretty heavily exposed. So that's not advisable still. And but yeah, that's sort of it. There is a bigger question about the balance that our defamation law strikes between the right to reputation and the right of free speech, which I think is still unbalanced in favour of reputation. And it's still just a fact that defamation law is largely used by people with privilege and power to protect it. And that's not what a law should be doing.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was awesome.
My pleasure.